Hello, class. Just to return back to what we didn't finish, I'm going to do a quick video here talking about 3 different levels of law enforcement, and then a little bit about private policing. So there's 3 different levels, as mentioned, local, state, and federal. And it's a complexity. It's probably the most complex system in the world, one of the most complex criminal justice systems in the world. With as far as law enforcement goes. Why do we have such a complex system? Well, there are, we have what's called 50 states, of course, and within the 50 states we have many different jurisdictions to cover: local, city, county, and of course state. So you got this legislative, defined jurisdiction, demarcated reality, and those demarcation, these territories are often overlapping, and it's can be complicated. Whose turf are we talking about? So is it local, state, or city? Depends on the law, right? So it's complex. And also, to put on top of that, you have drug laws that are at the state level. You have drug laws at the federal level, and even laws that are specific to local ordinances. So, so yes, technical investigatory specialization is something that is immense. Also part of this giant apparatus of law enforcement. So what problems do we have because of this complexity? Well, your textbook says, this is a quote from your text, says that when we're talking about this diversity of agencies, we have a confusing miasma of jurisdictional disputes, competition for limited funding, political maneuvering and manipulation as a result of that competition, and a stifling ego contest, and impenetrable bureaucratic and administrative inertia, and duplicated effort resulting in inefficiency. So it is a confusing miasma of jurisdictional disputes. That's the first point there that to me is a hallmark: confusing. So we could break this confusion down. We could, some say, by going to a national unified system. Let's treat law enforcement like the post office. And that is obviously has its issues. Well, the major issue is that states, even cities, have within a state have different sets of laws and different values, different beliefs and practices. So a unified system would be efficient and would break down some of the miasma confusion. Of course, post office isn't the most efficient, most fastly run organization as well, but as far as it's more clear cut as far as jurisdiction defined, and having a centralized, unified, central office would be interesting. I mean, we kind of have that to some degree. We have a cooperation of these various components of the local, state, and federal systems, and it is what we call the fusion centers. Fusion centers pulls together those resources, and I'll come back to that. But so why do we need to have a more efficient, a less confusing set of law enforcement agencies? Well, the reason is because the new era of policing, which we call Homeland Security, is driven by intelligence, and intelligence requires that we have a efficient flow of information. Intelligence-led policing requires to be an informed. It needs to be an informed apparatus that is everybody's on the same page. And the invisible enemy that the Homeland Security era is addressing is, of course, terrorism, and that has been the charge of the FBI and also the local law enforcement. Homeland Security is found to be just as important at the local level as you find it in the federal level. Why is that? Well, where are you going to see terrorist activities? It's going to be in the local level, not at, well, it will be something that will be potentially observed at in a state, federal level, quote unquote, if we're talking about cross states. But most of the times in the neighborhoods, or if it were to be a most of the time thing, it's going to be in a residential area. It's going to be cells that are hidden, invisible. And so we need shared intelligence between state, local, and federal apparatus. So 70 fusion centers today have been established in 49 states. These are multi-agency law enforcement facilities that are designed to enhance cooperative efforts between these different elements of law enforcement. The Tennessee Fusion Center says, quote unquote, the goal is to detect, prevent, investigate, and respond to criminal and terrorist activity, including a wide variety of offenders, gangs, immigrant smuggling operations, etc. In other words, the Fusion Center is not just about terrorism, it's also about all crimes. It's the all crime approach with the Fusion Center. So what they're realizing is that these fusion centers, while they were designed to target terrorism, they are actually quite useful at targeting all crimes. When we have a cooperative sense of shared intelligence, it's useful on all fronts. It's all crimes approach. The local law enforcement, we're talking about municipalities and sheriff departments. We're talking about upward to almost 13,000 municipal departments, 3,100 sheriff departments. We have the Hamilton County and the Chattanooga Police, which cooperate together. Chattanooga Police is about 500 employees, 500 cops. Put that in perspective of NYPD, which is one of the two largest. LAPD is the next one, which is about 37,800, which is a lot of employees in New York Police Department. Majority of municipalities and sheriff departments are fewer than 10. Sheriffs are elected. We'll talk a little bit more about the nature of elections when it comes to our professionals at a future chapter, but just note, they are elected officers and they are typically small, and we are talking about service and community style policing at this level, as we have talked about. Yes, on the state side, like we've talked about, very legalistic driven, like we've talked about already as well in class. We talked about that today. And it is there's two different models of state. You have the centralized model in which you combine both criminal investigations and the highway patrol. That's a centralized model. Decentralized model is one in which you have a separation of, like you find in Tennessee, TBI and the Tennessee State Highway Patrol, two separate agencies. And within those two separate agencies, you actually have multiple state level adjunct agencies as well. So you've got a vast array of, and decentralized, you have a vast array of local, not local, but specific, specialized agencies that operate on their own and don't have a centralized model. Guess where you find the most in decentralized in the country? You find decentralized models of law enforcement the most in the South, and somewhat in the Midwest too, where you have the most mistrust in centralized federal government. You have obviously the direction of let's not trust any sort of form of centralized model. So in the South, you have, like you find in the state of Tennessee Highway Patrol and the TBI. So it's predominant. All the rest of the country have a centralized model, but in the South we tend to not trust centralized models at all. Anyway. Federal system, 140,000, close to 140,000 law enforcement officers that are carrying a gun or have the capacity to carry guns, make arrests, execute warrants. And when we talk about 140,000, we're talking about a law enforcement arm to each of these departments. You have armed for agriculture, commerce, defense, energy, health and human services, Homeland Security, Department of Interior, Department of Justice, Department of Labor. They all have their own arm of law enforcement because they have laws that they have to implement. So they got to have force sometimes to be able to make them happen. And so some apparatus of law enforcement. But the two, of course, that we're most predominantly interested in is the Homeland Security and Department of Justice. Department of Justice, of course, is ATF, Bureau of Prisons, DEA, FBI, etc. And speaking of FBI, FBI roots back to 1908. It has been traditionally fighting crimes that are associated with like organized crime, crimes that cross state boundaries, in other words, and mafiosa, etc. But since 9/11, FBI has been redefined to address terrorism as one of their primary goals, and so this is they've been recharged since 9/11 with terrorism as their primary duty. So we got 13,000 special agents and 56 field offices, 400 satellite offices, really 20% female, which is really quite relatively high, because I think it's on 13-14% across the board of female officers. So relatively speaking, they have a higher number of female officers than the rest of law enforcement. The centralized office and where the training is done is Quantico, Virginia. This is also the location of the forensic labs in which local law enforcement can send on with no charge any sort of crime scene analysis that's necessary. There we have the CODIS, which is the DNA bank for the country. 8.5 million profiles is an old number. It's probably got more because they collect them every day. You don't have to be convicted to have your DNA collected. You can be just a suspect. So there's lots of unknown offenders as well that are collected in that database. So yes, we'll talk more about that in a future chapter. What's the difference? So we're moving into, we've talked about the three levels. Quickly want to cover as well private security. The difference between private and public, of course, is very simple. Public, of course, is run by the state and local governments, and federal governments. They're paid for by tax dollars versus private, which is funded by special interests, of course, I'm sorry, lost my word there. Private organizations, private citizens, and corporations, of course, and they're going to police how they are hired to police. They're going to serve the special interests, going back to the roots of law enforcement as far as the old school 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. We've looked at the video of the roots of law enforcement serving private interests. Well, that's what private security is doing today. If you have money, you can pay for your own enforcement. So tailored policing for whoever the money bags are. Two types of private security. There's the contract basis, where you have organizations like Walden who contract with banks or with corporations to go in and service with security. And then you have things like Walmart, who have their own security within. So personnel within and contract. Those are the two different types. And these services, the private security is something that is growing by leaps and bounds. Some say that it's because of the fact that, well, there's multiple reasons, but the growth is unmistakable. We'll talk about the reasons in a minute. The growth in private agency is supposed to be 4% per year as far as private agencies go, while public is at 2.8% per year. for funding wise in U.S. Private funding is greater than the combined budgets of all the local, state, and federal agencies put together. Really, it used to be that people who retired or people who wanted to get into law enforcement, they got their feet wet by going into private security. Now, today, the trend is people retiring from law enforcement to go into private security to make more money. It's better, sometimes better paid, and less stressful. So the growth of private security is something that is has multiple reasons. People are spending more time privately than public. We have our private domain. We spend more time in our virtual reality than we do in our actual walking into the neighborhood in reality. So public reality is minimized, private reality is heightened, and so we need more private security as a result, more private policing. The public domain has been underfunded for years, but the fiscal crisis of 2008 has brought that to new meaning. And also as well, we have this growth in elderly population with the baby boomer population in their winter years and able to afford private security. And corporations no longer, with the threats of increased crimes at the workplace and mass shootings, and increased fear of terrorism. So put all these things together, people want to invest in security, and having talked about computer crime and how we have to invest now into that domain with private security as well. So yes, that is all I want to say for now, and I hope this was useful, and I think I kept it about 15 minutes. I will see you all next class. Thank you.